Okay, so this is a review of The Carp by Yun Wang. I wanted to give you an image of the carp so you can have this idea of how huge a carp is, especially if we're talking about an Asian population, which is generally smaller than a typical white person. This carp is huge. So something to keep in mind is the size and the importance of the animal that we're talking about. So this poem is very disjointed. It's choppy and it's a little bit jarring to read. So I just want to go through a basic overview of the main points that Wang makes and what those mean. So our speaker starts off by saying that the day the speaker is born, the father catches a giant carp and he goes and he shares it with all of his staff. So this tells us immediately that this father, is happy to be sharing his good fortune. He's not selfish. He's willing to share. He's a little selfless because that carp could probably feed his family for an extended period of time, but he's willing to share it with his coworkers. The speaker points out, that they grow up yearning for the ocean. This is kind of an interesting illusion. Generally, the ocean indicates freedom and the renewal of life. And so it's interesting that the speaker notes, I grew up yearning for freedom, and that alludes to what happens later on in this poem. There's a reference to Confucius naming his son Carp. If you don't know about Confucius, he's considered the greatest Asian thinker, hugely influential. Confucianism is a philosophical belief, but it's held almost in a religious type manner for a lot of Asian countries. Confucius is incredibly important, and it's definitely ingrained in Asian culture. And so there's a reference about Confucius naming his son Carp, and the father going on to say, a carp is lucky. So we know Confucius named his son Carp. There's a luck element, and that brings us back to the beginning of the poem, where the father shares this carp because he caught something lucky, and so he's sharing his luck with his employees. And then we have this kind of ironic twist that happens right about the middle of the poem, where it says Confucius' son died young, which plays onto this idea of a carp being lucky. If the carp is lucky, why would the son die? And then also a reference to the father having 3 daughters. In most Asian cultures, having a son is very important. And so again, we have this kind of ironic twist on luck. So if this father was lucky because he caught a carp, he would have had a son, but instead he only has 3 daughters. So there is this question of, is the carp truly a lucky thing? It wasn't lucky for Confucius, and we know so far it hasn't been lucky for the father. This is where the poem really has a turnaround. The speaker references wandering around in their village and into their father's prison when she's 3 years old. So we know that in the 3-year time between her father catching the carp and sharing it, and now, where the child is wandering around, something has happened that put the father in prison. So it only took 3 years for this father to be in prison. And it goes on to talk about how the girl was caught and the father was beaten by these people he shared the carp with. So again, there's this question of luck. He shared this lucky carp with these employees, and 3 years later, they're beating the snot out of him. So there is this question of is there truly luck involved? Is this carp really lucky? And then it goes on to mention a case of where Confucius is mocked. Confucius doesn't understand millet or something, and he's mocked by a villager. And so 1,000 years after Confucius, who's been basically worshipped as a hero, he's made fun of, which is very much a change in Asian culture here. Now, what this is referencing is we have the Chinese Communist Revolution here, where traditional Chinese things that were important, like Confucius, suddenly became mocked and taboo and no longer a part of Chinese culture. So our speaker is commentating on the fact that things have changed. When the speaker was born and her father shared the carp, everybody was a good society. They all took care of each other. They honored Confucius. But by the time we have 3 years later, the Communist Revolution has happened in China, and there is this idea of forced shared community via communism. And because of that, her father, who's clearly fought against it, has been imprisoned. And Confucius is being mocked now as part of that communist revolution. It goes on to say that the father only now catches small fish. So we know that the speaker is reflecting on years past, and the father is only now catching small fish because that carp wasn't really lucky. And the father realizes that and acknowledges that and is clearly very scarred by his time in prison. That's why he's keeping to himself, only feeds his wife, he doesn't share with the community, which is an interesting commentary because communism is about sharing with the community. And the father did so before communism, but does not after communism. So it's a very interesting twist. The speaker goes on to observe that her friends mock her or doubt that her father ever caught a carp because he is so unlucky, because he's become this little man who catches little fish, and so they mock him for it. So again, in summary, is that the story of the carp is really about how communism changed China and how the speaker's father was sharing and the carp represented this luck in the beginning of the story, and then it shifts to represent this kind of terrible luck where he's beaten, he's arrested, Confucius's son dies, which is a reference back to the traditional days of China. So the carp kind of becomes this symbol of terror and horror and these bad things that happen to her family. So there you go. That's the carp.